Welcome to this new automotive news video. It's Thursday, May 7, 2026, and today we're going to talk about the French car tax. A report has just come out showing how much the French car tax brought in for the French government in the first quarter of 2026, and it's a record. Drivers are being taxed more now than ever before this year. There are a lot of interesting figures in this report, and you'll see that clearly. The ones who paid the most penalties aren't the rich or those who buy sports cars. It's the average French person. So we'll talk about that, and we'll also talk about a new study that's somewhat related, which shows that the vast majority of French people still don't want to buy electric cars. We'll also talk about the Chinese brand Chery, which is launching in Europe with a model that looks a lot like an Audi copy. We'll talk about the new Lexus TZ. And finally, we'll talk about Zeekr, another Chinese brand that's launching an electric car on the French market, capable of competing with the best high-end German electric models for only half their price. These are this Thursday's video topics. I hope you find them interesting and show your support. For that, you can leave a like on this video, subscribe for the next ones, boost this one if the option appears for you. It's really the most important thing for visibility. And leave a comment where you share your opinion on today's news and maybe also share your experiences. Are you among the French people who had to pay the tax at the start of 2026? Or did you choose to go for a hybrid or an electric vehicle because this penalty is clearly becoming a deterrent? And that's actually going to be the first topic of the day, the famous French car tax. Let me remind you, the original idea was to tax the most polluting cars, especially sports cars or those with large engines, to create a fund used to offer incentives to people who choose more environmentally friendly cars. At the time, it was hybrid cars, now it's electric cars. Year after year, the penalty has been made stricter. And in 2026, we end up with a penalty that applies to almost all vehicles. Even the smallest combustion engine car, even if it's just a family car now, gets penalized. On top of that, at first there was only the CO2 emissions tax. Now there's also a weight-based tax that affects all cars weighing more than 1,500 kilograms. 1,500 kilog, which means pretty much the vast majority of them, since manufacturers are almost only making SUVs or hybrid or electric cars now with very heavy batteries. And electric cars are exempt from the weight penalty for now. But that's about to change. It was planned for 2026, but the government reversed course at the last minute. Still, it's likely to happen in 2027. Now, the malus tax is just a new form of tax that we have to pay every time we buy a new car. Also, let me remind you that this incentive doesn't even support the purchase of electric cars anymore, since it's now funded by companies. We can no longer say that buyers of the most polluting cars are funding the electric vehicle transition. Let me remind you that the CO2 penalty now starts at 108 grams of CO2 emitted per kilometer, compared to 113 last year. As a result, according to this report, 50.3% of the cars registered since the first quarter of 2026 have been subject to the CO2 penalty. More than half. The penalty was meant for a few sports cars, but now it affects over half of all vehicles. We have a CO2 penalty with lower thresholds and a weight penalty with lower thresholds as well, going from 1,600 kilogram last year to 1,500 this year. This means that this year, fewer new cars have been registered in France than during the same period in 2025. Thanks to these lowered thresholds, the average penalty amount now reaches 1,143 euros compared to 1,095 last year. Fewer cars registered, but more taxes for each registered car means that in the first quarter of 2026, the penalty brought in about 230 million euros for the state. If things keep going like this year, and honestly, there's little chance that will change, it's quite possible that over the 12 months of 2026, the penalty will bring in nearly 1 billion euros for the French government, a 12% increase compared to 2025. The most interesting part is seeing which models generated the most penalty revenue. Indeed, in the top 10, you'll find some premium SUVs like the BMW X3 or the Q3, which you can somewhat understand being penalized since these are higher-end vehicles. Big vehicles that are a bit heavy. On the other hand, the model that brought in the most penalty revenue in France is the Peugeot 5008, which isn't really such a high-end vehicle. Well, if you want, you could say it's a status SUV, but you can't really say that the 1.2L PureTech hybrid engine it uses as a base is a large displacement engine, or sporty, or really powerful. What's really surprising is that in this top 10 of cars that bring in the most penalty revenue, we're starting to see entry-level vehicles with very small engines that are clearly not big models. For example, the Citroën C3 and the Dacia Sandero, two cars that are in 8th and 9th place respectively in the ranking of cars that brought in the most penalties this year. And here, clearly, these are entry-level cars. No one chooses a Sandero or a C3 as a fun car, and often those who go for these kinds of popular, less expensive models, it's still generally the French, the less fortunate ones, who end up having to pay a CO2 emissions tax because they can't afford to buy a more expensive hybrid vehicle or a much more expensive electric one, which would also be as versatile as their small gasoline car. If you're wondering why the French are avoiding dealerships and buying fewer cars, maybe there's part of the answer. Here, obviously, there will be comments saying, yes, if you don't want to pay a penalty, you just have to buy a small electric car. Except that 90% of French people don't want one. I'm not the one saying it. It's a new study conducted by the Deloitte firm. The study was carried out across the 27 countries of the European Union. 30,000 European citizens were surveyed, but we can zoom in country by country, and when we zoom in on France to look at the data from this study, only 10% of French people say they want to buy an electric car. For your information, this is a study that was conducted over the last months of 2025 and the first months of 2021. It's quite recent, which means that 90% of French people are still set on buying an internal combustion car or a hybrid. So yes, 10% is still a bit more than last year during the same period, when it was 9%, so that's an improvement of 1 point. According to this study, the obstacles to buying an electric car are exactly the same as those found in 2025, namely the purchase price of an electric car, the cost of replacing the batteries, the range, and the charging times. Arguments that will probably be much easier to challenge in a few years. In the meantime, it's still true that even though the average price gap between a combustion engine car and an electric car has narrowed in recent months, there is currently no affordable electric car on the European market that can match the versatility of the smallest and most affordable combustion engine cars. Just before, we were talking about the Dacia Sandero, which is in the top 10 for penalties. The price of an electric car with the same versatility and range as a Dacia Sandero is still much more expensive. If you want an electric car with about the same range as a Dacia Sandero, you either have to go for a Model 3, which will still cost around 45,000 euros, or look at the German brands where the prices are even higher. Probably more than 60,000 euros, so 45 or 60,000 for the average French person who already has trouble affording their Dacia Sandero. It's simply financially unthinkable to switch to an electric car. We'll see in a few years, maybe things will have changed by then. Maybe things will also change thanks to Chinese brands like Zeekr launching the 7 GT in France. It's an electric GT wagon that will develop up to 640 horsepower in its top versions. As for the battery, it's either 75 or 100 kWh, knowing that the 100 kW version can normally reach 650 kilometers of WLTP range. Like all latest generation electric cars, it's based on an 800-volt platform that allows it to charge from 10 to 80% in about 15 minutes, and recover about 300 kilometers of range in 10 minutes inside. It's like all modern cars. You'll find a 15-inch central screen, a 13-inch instrument cluster display, and a 35-inch augmented reality head-up display. This car was designed by Zeekr to compete a bit with the Model 3 and also to go after German electric sedans. Indeed, comparing it to a German car might be worth it, since the 650 horsepower versions will cost around 57,000 euros. At that price, German brands offer less power and range. However, the entry-level version costs 45,900 euros with a small battery and 519 kilometers of range. Here, it's a bit less interesting than a basic Tesla Model 3, which is sold for 37,000 euros. That's still 8,000 euros less, and it's capable of about the same range. Granted, with a longer fast charging time and maybe a slightly less luxurious interior. Speaking of high-end electric vehicles, Lexus has just unveiled its TZ, which will arrive on the European market in 2027. It's a 100% electric 6-seater SUV. So a big SUV. 5.10 meters long, 1.99 meters wide, 1.70 meters high. On the outside, you find all the traditional elements of Lexus design, like the large L-shaped lights at both the front and rear, and big 22-inch aerodynamic wheels. Inside, there are quite a lot of features. The large panoramic roof covers all 3 rows of seats. Heated and ventilated seats for the first 2 rows, optional heating for the 3rd row, and a driver's cockpit that includes a 12-inch display for the gauges and a 14-inch central screen for infotainment. So at Toyota, they're still a bit behind when it comes to electric vehicles because even with this version that uses large 96 kilowatt-hour batteries, the range isn't that impressive. The maximum announced range is 530 kilometers for the largest version with the biggest battery, and the charging speed isn't great either. 150 kilowatts, which allows charging from 10 to 80% in 35 minutes. We don't know the price yet, but it likely won't be cheap since it's a Lexus. Still, compared to its German competitors or even Korean competitors like the Hyundai Ioniq 9, which is in the same vehicle category, it's not great in terms of range, but also in terms of charging. An Ioniq 9 accepts up to 350 kilowatts of charging, more than twice as much. To finish, let's talk about Chery, which is launching a car in Europe that still looks surprisingly similar to an Audi. Some people will say it's a mix between an Audi and a Hyundai. Why not? It's called the Arizo S. It will arrive on the European market in a few weeks. We don't yet know at what price it will be sold, nor really the list of features. What we do know, though, is that in terms of powertrains, it will be much less high-end than what you find at Audi. Because while Audi or the German brands continue to make V6, V8, or V12 engines, here we're talking about four-cylinder gasoline engines of 1.5 or 2 liters, including 2-liter turbo versions. They would produce 257 horsepower. It's not bad, but it's not an AMG V8. There you go, that's it for today's news. I hope you found the video interesting. If that's the case, please show it by leaving a like, subscribing, and maybe even becoming a supporter with the join button below this video. See you again very soon for another video. Bye.